14 nations wave their flags, but half their wealth still sleeps in Paris. This is not independence. This is not sovereignty. This is the mask of freedom worn by chains that never broke. When Dr. Arikana Chihombori Kwao, the African Union's ambassador to the United States, spoke these truths, the world did not applaud her courage. Instead, the system struck back. She was silenced, fired, erased from the corridors of diplomacy. Why? Because she dared to expose what polite speeches never admit, that Africa is still being drained, dressed in the costume of partnership. But this story is not just about one woman losing her post. It is about a continent asking a forbidden question. If independence was real, why do our resources still flow outward? Our currencies still rest in foreign treasuries? And our voices still echo unheard in global chambers? Stay with us. This is not just a headline, it is a turning point. Subscribe now and let us walk together through a story the world would rather you forget. The silence of history is cracking, and from that silence a storm begins to rise. Power does not waste its time debating with the powerless. It ignores them, dismisses them, or laughs them away. But when a voice begins to land too close to the truth, when it cuts through the silence with sharp precision, the gloves come off. That is exactly what happened with Dr. Arikana Chihombori Kwao. She was not an activist standing on a street corner with a protest sign. She was the African Union's official ambassador to the United States, a position that demanded smiles, polite words, handshakes, ribbon cuttings, and silence in the face of injustice. Yet instead of reading from the script, she tore it to shreds. She said the unsayable. She declared that Africa was still colonized. Only this time, the chains were dressed in paper contracts, in aid packages, and in financial agreements that kept entire nations on their knees. The system reacted swiftly. She did not receive protection. She did not receive applause. She was dismissed, erased from her position, branded as dangerous not to Africa, but to those who profit from Africa. And that simple fact should make us pause. For if her words were nonsense, why silence her? You do not muzzle clowns, you laugh at them. But the world did not laugh. It panicked. Her accusations were not vague slogans. They were hard truths that every African citizen had felt, but few leaders dared to voice. France still controls the money of 14 African nations. This is not a rumor. It is a mechanism called the CFA franc, a currency born in the colonial era that survives to this day. The illusion is that it is African money. The reality is that it is printed in Paris, guaranteed by the French treasury, and subject to rules written in French law. Even more alarming, those nations must keep 50% of their foreign reserves locked away in Paris. Imagine working hard, depositing your salary into a bank, only to discover that you can only access it if a foreign power grants permission. That is not independence. That is financial slavery. And it does not stop with currency. The very structure of post-colonial agreements reads like a set of chains disguised as contracts. Nations were told that their language of instruction would be French, whether they liked it or not. They were told their armies could only be trained by France. They were told that their weapons could only be bought from French suppliers. They were told that they could never form military alliances with their neighbors without permission. And perhaps most astonishing of all, they were told that if war came, their allegiance must be to Paris, not to their own soil. This was the reality Dr. Arikana placed under the spotlight. And for doing so, she was punished. Yet her dismissal revealed something more powerful than her words, the fragility of the system itself. Because when truth threatens illusion, the illusion must strike back. She did not speak of poverty as destiny. She spoke of theft as policy. She reminded the world that after the Second World War, when Europe was broken and bankrupt, it was African resources that helped fuel Europe's recovery. Gold, uranium, oil, and cotton left African soil by the shipload. But the textbooks did not write that story. They wrote another, one where Africa was rescued by aid and charity. Her voice was dangerous because it flipped the narrative. Africa was not rescued. Africa was the rescuer. And it has been paying that hidden bill ever since. Think of Niger, where uranium is dug from the ground. That uranium keeps French lights glowing in Paris, while Niger's own villages remain in darkness. Think of Nigeria, exporting millions of barrels of oil each day, yet its citizens line up at petrol stations in scarcity. Think of Ghana, one of the world's top producers of gold, yet its streets do not glitter with wealth. These are not accidents. They are design. They are the deliberate leftovers of a colonial system that changed its clothing, but not its purpose. And when Dr. Arikana, standing on American soil, told American audiences that this arrangement was still active, the mask began to slip. She was not telling Africans what they already knew. She was telling the West what it desperately wanted to keep hidden from its own citizens. That is why her words became dynamite. That is why silence fell so quickly over her office. Because in her defiance, she cracked open a question too dangerous for the guardians of the old order. If independence is real, then why do the chains still hold? The chains are not relics of history. They are contracts written in the present. And the moment one leader tears those contracts apart, the entire house of cards begins to tremble. History is not silent. It is screaming through patterns. Each time a leader dares to expose the machinery of exploitation, the story ends the same way. Some are assassinated, some are overthrown, and some, like Dr. Arikana Chihombori Kwao, are pushed quietly out of the room. Different methods, same result. The powerful cannot tolerate a voice that dismantles their disguise. When Dr. Arikana picked up the microphone, she detonated more than a speech. She broke the unspoken agreement of diplomacy, the pact of silence. Diplomats are trained to smile, to bow, to speak of partnerships and progress, yet she tore that mask away. She told the world that foreign embassies on African soil were not symbols of friendship, but command centers of influence. She declared that aid was not generosity, but a leash carefully designed to pull nations back whenever they strayed. And she pointed to the most dangerous truth of all: Europe cannot survive without Africa. The reaction was swift and sharp. Inside the corridors of the African Union, pressure mounted. On the outside, Western capitals whispered their disapproval. And then the decision was made. She was dismissed. Her dismissal was framed as administrative, a bureaucratic decision. But beneath the surface, the fear was visible. They had not removed her because she was wrong. They had removed her because she was right. Her fate is part of a pattern that Africans know too well. Think of Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of the Congo, whose vision of real independence ended in bullets. Think of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, who declared that Africa must rely on its own hands, only to be cut down in his prime. Think of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, whose push for African unity and a pan-African currency led to bombs raining down from the skies. Different countries, different decades, but the same fate. Voices that called for sovereignty were silenced. This is the stage where Dr. Arikana's story shifts from an individual tragedy to a continental drama. Because while she was dismissed, others were rising. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, young Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward. At just 34 years old, he stood before his people and declared that the nation's resources belong not to foreign corporations, but to the people of Burkina Faso. His words echoed Sankara's, but this time they fell into ears that were tired of silence. Across Mali, Niger, and other states, citizens began to chant the same refrain: our soil, our gold, our dignity. The media reaction exposed the divide. In Western outlets, she was often painted as radical, controversial, or out of line. Yet in African communities, both on the continent and in the diaspora, her name became a rallying cry. Social media lit up with clips of her speeches, shared millions of times. Comment sections overflowed with both anger and pride. Anger at the system that silenced her. Pride that, at last, someone in a position of authority had spoken what people whispered for decades. Even within the United States, her message did not simply vanish. She had spoken these truths on American soil, in front of American audiences. That mattered. It forced the West to hear its own reflection, a reflection it did not like. Because if the public in Europe or America began to understand that their prosperity was built on Africa's poverty, that illusion of moral superiority would shatter. And so the safest option was removal, erasure, silence. But silence is not the same as victory. For every speech they tried to bury, 10 more rose on YouTube, TikTok, and community halls. For every headline that ignored her, grassroots networks amplified her words. The more they tried to suppress, the more visible she became. Her dismissal, instead of killing the message, gave it fire. This is the paradox of censorship. The attempt to silence becomes proof that the truth is dangerous. When people saw her lose her position, they asked, if she was lying, why would they fire her? Why not ignore her? That question alone was enough to ignite suspicion, to awaken curiosity, to plant seeds of doubt in the narrative of partnership. And so the story reached its emotional peak. On one side stood a lone woman stripped of her title, On the other stood governments, corporations, international institutions. And yet the imbalance of power only deepened the symbolism. It reminded the world that this struggle has never been equal. It has always been the lone voice against the machinery of silence. But what happens when that lone voice multiplies? What happens when her words, carried through digital echoes, meet the determination of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, the resilience of Nigerian protesters, the courage of Malian soldiers, and the awakening of diasporic Africans across the globe? The dismissal of one ambassador was meant to end a story. Instead, it may have begun a revolution of voices refusing to be silenced. The firing of Dr. Arikana was more than a personnel change. It was a signal, a warning that even those at the highest levels of African diplomacy are not free to speak truths that shake the foundations of global order. But signals cut both ways. While one side intended it as intimidation, the other side read it as proof. Proof that the struggle for sovereignty is not imaginary, but very real. In Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the message landed with particular force. These nations, already strained by conflict, poverty, and political turmoil, began to interpret her dismissal not as an isolated act, but as part of the larger system that keeps them vulnerable. And so in the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, ordinary citizens began to connect the dots. If leaders who speak the truth are removed, then silence must be serving someone else's interests. The effect was not just political, it was deeply social. Markets, schools, and community halls became spaces of debate. In Ouagadougou, the name of Ibrahim Traoré was invoked again and again, not only as a head of state but as a symbol of defiance. His coup was not celebrated as a mere military takeover. It was framed as a rupture with the old order, a declaration that resources like gold, cotton, and uranium could no longer flow outward unchecked. For many, the Ibrahim Traoré coup represented not only a national shift, but the possibility of a continental awakening. In daily life, the consequences of this shift are visible in both hardship and hope. Hardship because breaking away from former colonial powers often triggers sanctions, economic pressure, and political isolation. Mali and Niger, for example, have faced regional restrictions imposed by ECOWAS, making trade and travel more difficult for ordinary people. Burkina Faso has struggled with the dual burden of insecurity from insurgent groups and the economic weight of distancing itself from Paris. For villagers and shopkeepers, this translates into rising food prices, limited access to imported goods, and uncertainty about tomorrow. Yet alongside the hardship, there is a new atmosphere, one of cautious pride. Across these societies, young people chant slogans of sovereignty. Artists paint murals of Sankara and Traoré. Community radio programs debate the meaning of real independence. What was once whispered in private homes is now shouted in public squares. And though the pain of transition is real, so too is the sense of ownership, that Africa must endure short-term sacrifice to reclaim long-term dignity. Politically, the ripple effects are profound. Leaders across Africa, even those not aligned with the new wave of military governments, are forced to reckon with the public mood. They cannot ignore the rising demand for sovereignty. Citizens are asking sharper questions. Why do we still use foreign-imposed currencies? Why do our natural resources leave while our hospitals remain underfunded? Why do we send troops to peacekeeping missions abroad while our own communities lack security? These questions, once confined to intellectual circles, are now being asked in markets, mosques, and schools. The dismissal of Dr. Arikana also sparked a surge of engagement from the African diaspora. In Europe, North America, and beyond, Africans abroad saw her as a mirror of their own frustrations. Many began sending not only remittances, but also investments in professional skills back to the continent. Doctors opening clinics in Ghana, engineers starting factories in Nigeria, coders building tech platforms in Kenya, all became part of a quiet resistance to dependency. The diaspora, long seen as separate, started to reimagine itself as part of the solution. The broader political order is unsettled by these developments, because once one nation proves that breaking chains is possible, others will follow. That is the fear driving sanctions, threats, and diplomatic isolation. If Mali succeeds in trading directly with Russia, if Burkina Faso establishes new mining contracts on its own terms, if Niger claims full control of its uranium, then the illusion of dependency crumbles. And when that illusion crumbles, entire generations may never again believe in the myth that Africa cannot survive without its so-called partners. The most striking consequence of all is psychological. For too long, Africans were taught that poverty was natural, that corruption was inevitable, that without the guiding hand of Europe or America, the continent would collapse. Dr. Arikana's defiance and the echo of her words across the Sahel cracked that narrative. Even as she lost her title, her courage seeded a new mindset, that poverty is manufactured, not natural, that sovereignty is a choice, not a gift, that silence is complicity, not diplomacy. The question now is no longer whether Africa can survive without its chains, but whether the world can survive when Africa decides to break them. When a nation shifts course, the first tremors are felt not only at home, but across the globe. The dismissal of Dr. Arikana was not simply an African Union matter. It sent ripples through the international system. Because the truths she spoke were not just about Africa. They were about the way the world is organized and who holds the pen that writes the rules. Consider the United Nations. On paper, it is the conscience of humanity. 54 African countries stand as equal members, waving flags in New York each September. Yet in reality, those flags carry no weight in the chamber that matters most, the Security Council. Their 5 permanent members hold the power to decide war, peace, and sanctions. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. Not a single African seat, not a single African veto. The arithmetic is brutal. 1 vote in Paris outweighs 54 voices from Africa. Dr. Arikana named this for what it is, not oversight, but design. Her words also challenge Europe's delicate balance of dependence. Nations like France rely on African uranium, oil, and rare minerals to power their economies. Uranium from Niger keeps French homes bright, while Niger itself sits in darkness. Cobalt from Congo fuels the global tech revolution, yet Congolese communities live without basic infrastructure. When leaders in Burkina Faso or Mali threaten to cut those pipelines, European headlines label them radicals, not because they are wrong, but because they expose the fragility of European prosperity. The United States, too, has its own stake. Washington frames its presence in Africa as partnership, security cooperation, or development assistance. Yet behind those labels lies a strategic reality. Africa is a stage of competition, both economic and geopolitical. For America, losing influence in places like Niger or Burkina Faso is not just about resources. It is about losing ground to rivals. This is why speeches like Dr. Arikana's are treated as dangerous. They disrupt the narrative of benevolent partnership and reveal the harder truth of control. International organizations like the European Union and ECOWAS often present themselves as guardians of stability, but their actions betray their fears. Sanctions against Mali and Niger are justified in the name of democracy, yet the deeper concern is sovereignty slipping from foreign hands. The irony is sharp. The very institutions that claim to defend African independence often act to limit it, and yet cracks are appearing. The rise of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré has shown that small nations, even landlocked and resource-dependent, can stand up. The Burkina Faso revolution is not just a national event, it is a symbol that sovereignty is possible. And in the quiet corridors of power from Paris to Washington, that symbol is deeply unsettling. If one small landlocked nation can rise, what stops the rest of Africa from following the same road? The road ahead for Africa is neither smooth nor certain. To step away from dependency is to walk into storms, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and economic retaliation. Yet storms are not only dangers, they are also the weather of change. And Africa today stands at a crossroad, to retreat once more into silence, or to endure the storm and emerge with sovereignty intact. For nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the choices are immediate and practical. How to secure borders against insurgencies while building internal trust. How to replace contracts signed under the shadow of colonial power with new agreements that truly serve their citizens. These are not abstract questions. They are decisions that shape the price of food in markets, the salaries of teachers, and the future of children. Short-term hardship is unavoidable. Breaking ties with systems that drained Africa for decades means disruptions in trade and aid. But hardship is not the same as failure. Across the continent, communities are already adapting. Farmers are organizing cooperatives to reduce dependency on imported goods. Local industries are experimenting with processing raw materials instead of exporting them. Citizens, once passive, are demanding accountability from leaders in ways unseen for generations. The shift is not just political, it is cultural. Central to the future is the African diaspora, For decades, Africa's most skilled sons and daughters were educated abroad, often remaining in Europe or America. Colonial systems designed it that way, to drain talent outward. But today the tide is turning. Doctors trained in London are opening clinics in Accra. Engineers in Toronto are setting up factories in Lagos. Tech entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley are investing in Nairobi. Each return is more than personal. It is a dismantling of the myth that Africa cannot build without foreign hands. This is where hope meets strategy. If Africa processes its own cobalt into batteries, if it refines its oil into petrol, if it builds its own nuclear plants from its own uranium, the balance of global power would tremble. The world knows this. That is why narratives of poverty and dependency are kept alive. Because if Africa is seen for what it truly is, the richest continent on Earth, then the illusion of global hierarchy collapses. But revolutions are not won in a day. The coming years will test Africa's endurance, unity, and vision. Will leaders resist the temptation of corruption? Will regional blocs support sovereignty instead of punishing it? Will ordinary citizens stay the course when prices rise and challenges mount? These questions will decide whether today's defiance becomes tomorrow's dignity. One truth, however, is undeniable. The seeds have already been planted. And once seeds are planted, harvest is only a matter of time. The harvest has not yet come, but the seeds are already in the ground, waiting for Africa's dawn. Africa is not poor. Africa is being robbed. This is the message Dr. Arikana carried, and it is the truth that cost her position. Yet her dismissal did not bury the truth. It amplified it. Across villages and cities, across the diaspora, in digital platforms, her words now live on as a challenge to the illusion of independence. For decades, the story was written by others. That Africa needed saving, that aid was its lifeline, that sovereignty was a song sung at ceremonies but not practiced in reality. Today, that story's cracking. From the streets of Ouagadougou to the markets of Bamako, from Niamey to Accra, citizens are asking the forbidden question, what if the chains can be broken? What if Africa can stand not as a beggar, but as a partner? This is why the Ibrahim Traoré coup has become more than a national episode. It is a symbol of resistance, a sign that even the youngest of leaders can awaken the spirit of Sankara and remind the world that soil, gold, and dignity are not for sale. And this is why the Burkina Faso revolution is not just about one country. It is about a continent that refuses to remain silent, a continent that insists its wealth belongs first to its children, not to distant treasuries. But here lies the greater truth. The struggle ahead will not be easy. There will be storms, sanctions, and setbacks. Yet Africa's history is proof that seeds grow in the harshest soil. Already the diaspora is returning with skills and capital. Already communities are building alternatives to dependency. Already the idea of sovereignty is becoming more than a dream. It is becoming a demand. So ask yourself, if Africa claims its place, will the world listen or will it tremble? Do not look away. The harvest of dignity is on its way. Subscribe now, share this journey, and add your voice to a chorus that can no longer be silenced. Because the future will not be gifted. The future will be claimed. And Africa is rising to claim it.